The inspector opens by labeling it private property, but quickly brushes aside the fact that it's publicly funded, a detail that directly challenges that claim. News Now Yorkshire shows how, when that line doesn't hold, the argument shifts again, this time toward an allegation of trespass. That's where the response brings things back into focus. Trespass, in its basic form, is a civil matter unless specific conditions apply that elevate it further. So asking whether it's a police issue or a civil one isn't a trick question. It's a fundamental point. Without those additional factors, it doesn't automatically fall within police enforcement at the same time. There's a clear imbalance in the interaction. The inspector is making demands and assertions, yet refuses to provide his own identification details and even appears to conceal his ID card. That creates a one-sided dynamic where authority is asserted outward, but accountability isn't equally offered. When that balance is missing, the interaction shifts away from transparency. It becomes less about applying rules consistently and more about control without the same level of openness expected in return. The hostile label appears the moment the inspector starts losing control of the exchange. News Now Yorkshire shows how nothing in Plodding Along's tone actually changes. He remains calm, measured, and focused on simple questions. But that composure becomes an issue when it can't be pressured into compliance. The situation then takes another turn when the inspector claims he needs personal permission for the footage to be posted online. That isn't a misunderstanding. It suggests authority that doesn't exist. Officers don't have the power to approve or block recordings simply because they're on camera or don't like how they appear. When composure is reframed as hostility and new rules are introduced without basis, the focus shifts away from any legitimate concern. It stops being about public order or professional conduct and starts to reflect a reaction driven by frustration. The interaction becomes less about applying the law and more about asserting control in a situation where that control is slipping. Telling him to move to a public area is where the inspector's position starts to unravel. News Now Yorkshire shows how Plodding Along points directly to the double yellow lines running past the station, markings laid by the council and governed by public highway rules. Those don't appear on genuinely private land, and that physical detail undercuts the claim immediately. He then strengthens the point by referencing Section 33 of the Criminal Justice Act 1972. which recognizes lawful access in places the public are ordinarily entitled to be. It's a clear, structured argument grounded in both visible evidence and legal context. Yet the inspector doesn't engage with it at all. Instead, the response shifts away from substance and into personal remarks, repeatedly labeling him as angry. That move doesn't address the issue, it avoids it. When a clear point isn't answered and the focus turns to character instead, it signals that the original position can't be properly defended at that stage. The interaction stops reflecting authority based on understanding and starts to look like a reaction driven by frustration, where the legal footing has already been lost. This is the point where the inspector drops any real sense of professionalism. News Now Yorkshire shows how he refuses to identify himself, not because of any operational risk, but because he claims PA doesn't like public servants. That reasoning is irrelevant. Personal perception has nothing to do with an officer's duty to identify themselves during an interaction. Disliking someone isn't misconduct, and it certainly doesn't remove an obligation tied to the role. Yet he continues to rely on the same argument about being on private property, as if that somehow cancels accountability. It doesn't. Location doesn't override professional standards. PA responds by bringing it back to principle, pointing out that under the Police Code of Ethics, identification isn't optional. It's a core requirement linked to transparency and maintaining public trust. It applies regardless of mood, disagreement, or environment at that stage. The issue is no longer about where the interaction is taking place. It's about whether basic standards are being followed. And when those standards are ignored, it raises serious questions about how authority is being exercised in that moment. Calling the station a sensitive site comes in late, and it feels like a fallback rather than a clearly established position. News Now Yorkshire shows how, if a location is genuinely treated as sensitive, consistent standards would apply to everyone. Yet staff are moving in and out without visible ID, and the concern only appears once a camera is pointed in that direction. That's where PA's point about inconsistency lands. Sensitivity isn't something that switches on and off depending on who's holding a camera. If it's real, it applies across the board, not selectively when it becomes inconvenient. What ultimately weakens the inspector's stance is how openly personal opinion starts to shape the interaction. There's no clearly defined rule, boundary, or lawful power being enforced, just a reaction to being filmed. That shift matters because it moves away from objective policing and into subjective preference. PA cuts straight through it. Officers don't enforce personal feelings or vibes. They enforce what's clearly defined and legally grounded. And when that foundation isn't there, the entire position starts to fall apart. Bringing up the general dangers of policing at this stage is a clear shift away from the actual issue. News Now Yorkshire shows how broad risk is being used in place of specific reasoning. But general danger isn't a substitute for clear grounds tied to the person in front of them. PA cuts through that immediately by asking the key question: what violent act has he actually committed? That's the point everything hinges on. And the silence that follows is telling. It shows there's no concrete behavior to point to, only a general narrative being applied to a specific situation. You can't take the most serious risks encountered in policing and project them onto someone without evidence. Doing that turns real concerns into a shield, something used to justify action when there's no clear legal basis left at that stage. The focus isn't on what's happening. It's on what could be imagined. And when imagination replaces facts, the justification behind the interaction starts to collapse. Accusing PA of intimidating staff is the inspector's final attempt to regain control, and it's a risky one. News Now Yorkshire shows how there's no clear conduct to support it. No disruption, no obstruction, no interference. Just someone standing and filming. Yet suddenly, it's being reframed as something far more serious. Labeling it as aggravated trespass raises the stakes, but that offense requires deliberate disruption of lawful activity, not simply causing discomfort or drawing attention. There has to be a clear, intentional act that interferes with others, not an assumption based on presence alone. What stands out is the timing. The allegation escalates only after earlier arguments fail to hold. When ordinary filming doesn't justify intervention, it's rebranded as something more serious. That shift doesn't strengthen the position. It highlights how thin the foundation has become. At that point, the interaction moves away from applying the law to fitting the situation into it. And when serious accusations are made without clear supporting facts, it raises serious concerns about how those powers are being used in practice. floating the idea that he may be committing aggravated trespass without pointing to a single act is the clearest giveaway. News Now Yorkshire shows how that one word, may, carries the entire claim. It suggests seriousness without requiring any proof to back it up. The PA doesn't react emotionally. He breaks it down with simple, direct questions. Who's been affected? Who's been obstructed? And who has actually been prevented from doing their job? There's no clear answer, because nothing concrete has happened. Staff carrying on with their duties don't become victims just because someone is filming nearby, and suspicion alone doesn't create harm. What really exposes the weakness is how quickly the allegation falls apart under basic scrutiny. Aggravated trespass isn't about annoyance or discomfort. It requires clear intent to disrupt lawful activity. By forcing those points, PA highlights the gap between the claim and the reality. Instead of filling that gap with facts, the response drifts back into hypotheticals and toned IT that stage. It stops looking like enforcement and starts to resemble guesswork. When an allegation can't be tied to a specific action, person, or outcome, it exists more as an idea than a lawful basis. The ending makes that clear. Faced with questions that can't be answered and claims that can't be sustained, the inspector doesn't resolve the situation. He steps away. No warning, no follow-up, no action. Just silence. That moment says everything. When authority retreats without conclusion, it often reflects that the position couldn't hold once properly examined. If you found this breakdown useful, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to keep these discussions going. I'm the Audit Assessor. This was episode 13. See you next time.